Hi everyone, it's Melissa. Happy New Year. I am so excited to be here today to talk about my favorite books that I read in 2021. These aren't things that were published in 2021. I very rarely read new releases. And spoiler alert, but you will see a lot of classics on this list this year. These are just the things that I read this past year that just stood out to me and have become new favorites of mine. Last year, I did separate lists for my top 10 fiction and nonfiction. I didn't have the best nonfiction reading year this year. I read a lot of things that were good but didn't necessarily blow me away. So rather than do an entire top 10 list, I am lumping them in together. I haven't ranked nonfiction against fiction because I have a hard time comparing those two genres. So I have just 3 nonfiction books that are my top of the year, and then I have 7 or 8 fiction books that I would love to share with you. So we're going to start with the nonfiction. At number 3, my third favorite nonfiction of the year is a graphic memoir that I've raved about a lot recently, and it's Dancing at the Pity Party, a Dead Mom graphic memoir by Tyler Fetter. So Tyler Fetter lost her mom when she was about 19, and this is a look back at that time. She wrote this 10 years later, so there's a lot of reflection that she's been able to do. So I thought it was kind of like the perfect amount of sitting in that raw emotion, but also time to process through some of those emotions. I think it was a beautiful tribute to her mother, and at the same time, a look at how she coped with that loss and how it changed her as a person. This is technically a young adult graphic memoir, but I'm 36 and I loved it. I also lost a parent, so there was kind of like a personal connection there, and she just articulated a lot of emotions that I think are hard to make other people understand if they haven't lost a parent at a relatively young age. And I think for that reason, it just really spoke to me personally. But it's also, not that it's a how-to, but there are things in here that regardless of your age, I think are just good things to know so that you can be a better friend to someone who loses someone close to them. It had that kind of a little bit like sarcastic, snarky bits of humor woven throughout. So it wasn't wallowing. It wasn't overly sentimental. It was just my kind of tone as well, and I think a lot of people would like this. My second favorite nonfiction of the year is another memoir, and that's Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Everyone's been talking about this year, and I think with good reason. So in case you aren't aware, Chanel Miller is the victim of the very publicized Stanford rape case from, I forget what year now, a few years ago now, and the perpetrator basically got off with basically no sentence at all. I think he spent like 3 months in jail or something like that. And it really was a miscarriage of justice. And what's so great about this book is, first of all, the writing is gorgeous. She's a very eloquent, very rich writer. She really makes it easy to understand as much as is possible what she was feeling. I love how this memoir is, although it's very focused in on her experience, it's very broad in how it deals with that experience. So it talks about the night of the assault, and it talks about the trial, what it's like to be a victim during a trial. Obviously, there were repercussions of the assault on her mental health and other aspects of her life, but also the trial and how the trial weighed on her and how much that affected her life as well. And it really shines a light on how the justice system really isn't set up to help victims necessarily. And I just think that she puts all of these pieces together for you so you can see the whole of the reality of this happening to someone and what that does. So I just thought it was not only interesting in that way, but also beautifully written, and I would highly recommend it if you think you're able to read the subject matter. onto my top nonfiction of the year, and this just has to go to The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down by Anne Fadiman. This is a cultural history in a way. It's looking specifically at one family, and particularly one young girl's life and her parents and how they tried to cope with her illness. But it also gives great cultural and historical context to their story. So this is about a young girl called Leah Lee, and her family were Hmong refugees. They fled from Laos to America, and she was the first of all of the siblings born in America, and she had very severe epilepsy. And this book basically chronicles that whole journey of diagnosis, of illness, of treatment, of cultural clashes between her family, her parents, and the medical system, and between Hmong culture and American culture. And the reason that this is the top of my list is not just because it was a very compelling story and very interesting culturally, and also a little bit as a medical biography in a way, but because it really made me think and reflect on the medical system, and it really changed my point of view on a lot of things. What I think this book does so well is share the story in the most balanced way possible. No one is painted out to be a villain. The doctors worked tirelessly to try to help this girl. They were giving their all to make her well, to keep her alive. And sometimes her parents could be a barrier to them providing what they believed was the best medical care for her. But on the flip side, her parents were so loving, took such good care of her, did everything in their power to keep their daughter healthy and happy and loved. And the paternalistic medical system here was a barrier for them to take the best care of their child. Fadiman just does a truly expert job at presenting the facts and showing you the humanity of both sides, the humanity of the doctors who really care for this patient and want her to do well, and the side of the parents who obviously want the best for their daughter. It really was a no-brainer to put this in the top spot. Now on to my top fiction that I read in 2021. I have, 8 books here. In number 8, a classic. I warned you there's going to be a lot of classics on this list. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Not very many people feel in the middle about this book. You either love it or hate it. And I happen to fall in the I love it camp. It is really a story about cruelty, and it is about cycles of abuse and how hard it is to break out of those cycles. One of the main characters, Heathcliff, is a mean person. He's absolutely cruel to the people around him, the people that he's supposed to care about. But he's also a very complex character, and I think if you dig through this, you can see the reasons why he's cruel. Not that there's necessarily a good reason, but there is a reason, and how his cruelty just kind of corrupts those around him. But I think there's a lot of redemption in a way. Maybe not for every character, but it's not a, I was going to say it's not a bleak story. It is a bleak story, but I don't think the ending is bleak. And there's a lot of hope at the end of this. And it just has such great characters and great atmosphere that I was completely sucked in. At my number 7 spot, I have Severance by Ling Ma. This is a literary zombie apocalypse novel. There's a slow build of tension, and it really gives you time to reflect on things as you're reading. It's told basically in 2 different time points. So it follows Candace. She's a young working professional in New York, and it follows her right before the apocalypse, or kind of as the apocalypse starts to happen. And then part of the story follows the post-apocalypse where she has joined a group of a handful of people, of survivors, and they are on their way to this warehouse where, or this building where they think they'll be safe. I would describe the story as very melancholy. There's a lot of imagery about, and just scenes about working and kind of being on that hamster wheel and feeling like a zombie going through the motion of life. There's a lot in here about community and building community and family and relationships made and relationships lost and like severance, as the title implies, severance of community and the people that you care about, and cutting ties or having ties cut with family or with your life. And it's just one of those ones that has stuck with me, and I think a lot about Candace's journey. At number 6 is one book, but really 3 books, because it's a trilogy, but it is To Green Angel Tower by Tad Williams. I'm choosing this one particular book for the purpose of this list, but really it's the trilogy as a whole, because this book is not really anything without the books that precede it. This is the 3rd and final book in an epic fantasy trilogy. We follow a young man named Simon. Simon is very much a daydreamer. He wants adventure and he wants to basically live the stories that are in legend. Of course, things don't go quite how he'd like when he is thrust into an adventure. It's not what he thought it would be like. He as a character carries a lot of this story, and the other part of this trilogy that is so good is the world building. There's a lot here to really sink your teeth into. So if you want to get lost in a world and you want a character at the center who you can really root for, who is in ways an annoying teenager who doesn't know anything about life, but in other ways just has a heart of gold and is really trying to do the right thing. And if you don't mind a very dense fantasy with lots of characters and lots of geography and language and world building, then I would highly recommend this trilogy. Number 5 on my list is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This is a story of 2 sisters who are sadly separated. We follow Celie and, to a lesser extent, her sister Nettie. They are growing up in poverty in the South, and they are separated. Celie has to marry and go move in with a man who is not very kind to her, and she faces a lot of abuse there. And this book is just a beautiful look at specifically sisterhood, but about relationship, about the sacrifice you make for those who you love. There's a lot in here about the choices people make and how they can get stuck in one way of being. One of my favorite parts of this book was the character growth of not just Celie, but almost every single character in this book. Even the ones who you don't really like, who are abusive, the more you get to know the characters, the more you feel for all of them. And they all seem kind of stuck in this pattern. But there is something to everyone's story in this book. The writing is really rich and intimate. You really feel like you get to know Celie especially, and the characters are just phenomenal. Number 4 on this list is something I never thought would make a top list, but here it is. That's Moby Dick by Herman Melville. It's about a young man named Ishmael, and he gets a job on a whaling ship captained by Captain Ahab, who is obsessed with a white whale and hunting down this whale. And of course this book is about obsession, but there is so much going on. It sounds like a mess, but it just worked. Everything just clicked together. There were maybe a couple of sections in this book that got a little bit dry, but all of this talk I hear about Moby Dick being like so boring, I don't know what book you're reading if you say that. It was full of beautiful passages. Some of the writing in this book is outright gorgeous. The characters are really interesting and a bit eccentric, but very interesting. It's full of action and adventure. It's full of reflection and philosophy. And the most surprising part to me is a huge section of this book is really funny. Like, really funny. I laughed, I cried, I experienced the whole gamut reading this book. I thought it was fun, funny, harrowing, reflective, tense at times. It just had everything I wanted. Number 3 on my list is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is, I would say, a highly philosophical book, but in a way that is digestible and readable, but definitely has so much in it that I know I'll reread this many times and pick up something new every time I read it. It follows Dorian Gray and 2 of his friends. Dorian is a very good-looking young man, and one of his friends, Basil, paints a portrait of him. And through some magical or spiritual phenomenon, the portrait ages while Dorian remains young, and the portrait takes on his sins in a way where Dorian's other friend, Lord Henry, really kind of takes Dorian under his wing, but corrupts him in a way and leads him to believe that the most important thing in life is to be young and beautiful. This is what ends up being important to Dorian, and the portrait takes on his sins, and the portrait starts to look old and ugly, and nothing bad that Dorian does affects his youthful good looks. In Victorian times, there was kind of a pervasive idea that your moral character was reflected in how you looked, that if you were a good-looking person, you were probably a good person, and that if you did awful things, then you would turn into kind of like a grizzled, ugly old person, maybe sooner than other people would. So we have to kind of accept that context of how Victorians viewed beauty. This is kind of like a coming-of-age story, but in the most peculiar way possible. And rather than someone just growing into the person they'll be, this is someone becoming corrupted into someone they maybe didn't have to be. I just thought it was excellent. Number 2 on my list is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is a gothic novel where a young woman marries a man who has fairly recently, I think it was like a year previously maybe, had been widowed. She goes back to live with him at his very big, very fine estate, but feels haunted in a way by Rebecca, his previous wife. All of the servants always bring up Rebecca's name. Just everyone around her can't stop talking about Rebecca. The protagonist, who's never named in the novel, and I think that's very telling because she doesn't even really know who she is. She's very, very young. She is just constantly being compared to Rebecca and comparing herself to Rebecca, and she can't find her footing as her own person, as who she is to herself, but who she is as a wife, as the new Mrs. De Winter, because the old Mrs. De Winter has never really left. She doesn't feel like she's in her house. She feels like she is squatting in Rebecca's house. I really love the exploration of self that the protagonist has to go through, and the way she comes to realize who she is, what kind of a person she is not how I expected it to happen. It's another one of these slow burn, slowly building tension kind of books. You're just sitting in the narrator's feelings, in her feelings of inadequacy, and you feel very unmoored. You feel very confused as she is. Just a very haunting, very atmospheric read. Now for my number 1 read of the year. It's the book that I have thought about the most, and that just tells me that this is the fave of the year, and that's Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is about a group of people who grow up in this sort of boarding school, and you don't really know much about them except that they're special in some way. They go to the special boarding school and they're cared for by the guardians/teachers there. The book is from one of these students' perspectives. Her name is Kathy, and we kind of go between her in her kind of like young adulthood after she's left school and back to her reminiscing about her time at this school with her friends and fellow students. This book is big on reminiscence and nostalgia and memory. There's a lot in here about acceptance, like acceptance of kind of your own limitations, like your lot in life, as it were, or not necessarily fate, but just coming to terms with living the life that is presented to you. And the thing that's just done so well in this book is the looking back of people in adulthood, looking back on their life as children and putting the pieces together of things that you maybe didn't comprehend at the time. There's so many things that happen during childhood that you just can't either appreciate or fully comprehend. They don't really make sense until years later. This book is very haunting. It has kind of this overall tone of sadness and melancholy and more so nostalgia, kind of that bittersweet feeling of thinking about childhood and kind of that aching over childhood. Like I said, it has just stuck with me and I am still thinking about it, and I'm probably going to be still thinking about this book for a long time. So those are my top books that I read this year. I look forward to watching all of your videos about your top books. If you don't have a channel, please leave a comment below about the best things that you read this year. I would love to talk to you. Thank you as always for watching, and we'll chat soon. Take care. Bye.